Hey guys, it's Randy with Lowbuck LS here again, and this week we're going to do a little follow-up on our cam tuning video from this week. But first I just wanted to say I just noticed we passed 400 subscribers on the channel, so thanks a lot to everyone who's taken the time to subscribe and to comment. And yeah, it's the channel's growing slowly, but it's growing. So yeah, and I actually wanted to start off, first section is this video. Oh, it's always weird when I'm out filming and somebody drives by. I wonder what they think of, they're like, why is that guy talking to his phone? But anyways, on my last video, we did the cam tuning to get the truck to idle decently. There's still a few tweaks that I will make towards the end of this video, but I got a question on that video, or a comment from, I think his name is, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but Filistino, and he just asked if I could go into a little more depth as to why I changed, basically why I did what I did. So I actually put together a little PowerPoint presentation here with some of the concepts of idle tuning after you do a cam swap. So we'll fire up the computer here and walk through that PowerPoint, and then we'll hop in the truck and do a little more tuning and just do a few more tweaks to get our idle dialed right in after this cam swap. So we'll hop on the computer now and go through this PowerPoint of basic cam idle tuning concepts. So talk to you in a bit. Okay guys, like I said, had a question, and thanks to Filistino for asking the question. And so I just made this little PowerPoint here to go into a little more detail as to what changes I made and why I changed them. So let's start with why we even need to change our idle settings. So basically, aftermarket cams, obviously that's the reason we put them in, is because they're more efficient and make more power than a stock cam. But that's only in the RPM range that they're designed for. Like for that camshaft I bought, the Summit 8701, its range is 2200 to 6500 RPM. So in that range, it's more efficient and makes more power than the stock camshaft. But below that RPM range and at idle, the aftermarket cam is less efficient than the stock camshaft. And that's because of the increase in the overlap between the intake and exhaust lobes. Like, my cam isn't quite there, but on some of these cams where you've got like a positive overlap, you're basically for a short time your intake and exhaust valve are open at the same time. So it basically makes the cam less efficient at idle and low RPM. So that's why my truck wouldn't run with those stock idle parameters. The new cam's less efficient at idle, so it needs more timing and more idle airflow than the stock camshaft. So the first thing I went in and changed was increase that base idle RPM set point. And this is basically the target that the ECM wants to shoot for and wants the engine to idle at. So because of that increased overlap of this aftermarket cam, basically they don't idle as stable as a stock cam, so you need to increase the speed that they're idling at. And I kind of define a stable idle as being able to stick within that target set point plus or minus 50 RPM. So that's why the first thing I did in that last video was went into this table and added 225 RPM to every cell. Basically, I wanted the slowest idle speed the ECM would ever command to be 750, and that's normally when the truck is operating. The engine coolant temp is, well, it's probably it's in this row here anyways. So I wanted the lowest speed that the ECM would tell the truck to idle at to be 750. So Next slide, I'll tell you how I got that 750 number. And it is basically from this table here, which I believe came from somewhere on the HP Tuners forum. So I looked at my cam card. It has an overlap of -1 degrees. And so looking at this table here, it's less than 0. So that's why I went for a target idle RPM. It says 750 to 850, but I went on the lower end of that. Basically, the ideal idle speed for any cam, you want it to be the lowest RPM that it will be stable at, like stay within that plus or minus 50 RPM, like lower is better. I don't totally agree with this timing part of the table. I ended up with a lot more than an extra 2 degrees of timing, but as you'll see later in the presentation, I think I might have actually screwed up and went a little too high on my base idle spark advanced tables, but we'll tweak that when we hop on, do some live tuning on the truck at the end of this presentation here. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about how this ECM controls the idle, and it's different on newer Chevys. Newer Chevys with the electronic throttle actually use that electronic throttle as your idle air control motor. But since this is an older, it's P01, or some people call it the 0411 computer. Basically, it's got 2 ways of maintaining that target speed that we entered into that last table. There's the fastest way of controlling that idle speed is by adjusting the ignition timing, and it does that based on the overspeed and underspeed tables, which we'll look at a little later in this presentation. So if your actual idle RPM is less than the target, like let's say from that table, the ECM wants the engine to idle at 750 RPM. If your actual idle is 700, it's going to increase that ignition timing to speed up the engine. And if your idle RPM is more than the target, like let's say it's 800, it'll pull timing out to slow down the engine. The other way of controlling the idle, and so ignition timing is a fast acting way of, it reacts fast, and it's a fast way of controlling the idle basically. But there's another way that the ECM tweaks the idle speed, and that is with the idle air controller, and that's a slower reacting way of controlling the idle speed. So and it opens and closes the idle air controller, and like I said, on newer vehicles it just opens and closes the electronic throttle, and that's basically like stepping on the gas a little bit with your foot. It just lets a little more air into the throttle body. And so to decide how far it opens that idle air controller motor, the ECM looks at this base running airflow table, and there's another table it uses in there that converts this grams per second or desired airflow into idle air controller steps, but I think you only need to change that if you're going with like an aftermarket throttle body. So since I've got the stock throttle body that came with my 5.3, I left that idle air controller steps table alone. But that's why at the start of that last video I had to go in and adjust this table. I adjusted most of the cells to 14, and that's basically like telling that idle air controller stepper to open the gas a little more. It's like putting your foot on the gas pedal a bit to keep the truck idling better. So then I went on to try and find the ideal idle timing, and this is where I think I might have screwed up a bit. So I locked in that idle air controller at a fixed, I think it was 65 steps or something like that, using that VCM controls, and that basically fixes the throttle position at one position, Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to see the RPM change, because if I bumped up the timing 5 degrees, it would want to idle faster, but the ECM would be stepping back on that idle air controller to try and maintain that set point. So in order to find out what timing the engine likes to idle at, I locked out that idle air controller at a set position. So then I went in and adjusted the timing using those VCM controls to find the idle advanced setting, or the degrees of timing that give me the highest idle RPM and the highest manifold vacuum, which is the lowest manifold air pressure reading. So that basically is finding what degrees of advance of timing that cam is most efficient at. But I think now, looking back and thinking about it, I think I might have done this wrong, because if I've set my base timing at the max RPM that cam will run at, then the ECM can't do its correction through the overspeed and idle speed, underspeed idle tables, because if it's calling for more speed, it'll add more timing, but the cam's basically maxed out already. So I think I might, at the end of this video, I'll go back in and adjust those base timing maps to around 25 degrees, and that'll basically give the ECM a bit of room to work. Like if it's at 25 degrees of timing and the idle speed is dropping, it can still increase it up to 30 and increase the idle speed. Whereas if it's already running at 30, basically going from 25 to 30 is going to have more of an effect on the timing or the idle speed than going from 30 to 35. So I think I'm going to go back in and tweak that at the end of the video. So then, once I had found out the ideal idle spark advance, I basically went into the spark advance tables for drive and park, and that is basically the tables that the computer looks at when you're idling and decides what to put in for timing. And there are a couple other tables with engine coolant temperature and intake air temperature that put a multiply in there. So if your coolant is getting hot, or if the air coming into the engine is getting hot, it will pull timing. So that can change your idle spark advance as well. And again, I'm thinking I went a little high initially. Like you can see, I was at 30 degrees in the idle timing area, so I'll probably go back and change that to 25 degrees on both the in park and in gear tables. Then I went in and changed that idle overspeed and underspeed tables, and those are the tables that computer looks at when it's controlling idle RPM with timing. It looks at this table and says, okay, I want the engine to be idling at 750 RPM, but it's actually at 850. I'm going to pull 6 degrees of timing to slow it down. So basically I reduce the amount of control by moving all the numbers over a couple cells, and that's because you guys know when you put in a rowdy camshaft, it isn't as stable at idle. So we basically want to give the cam a bit of room to wander without having the ECM trying to fight the natural kind of up and down changes of the cam. So that's why we went in and modified those tables. And then the last thing I did in that video was went back into that base running airflow, and I think it's called the idle airflow table. So initially I just plugged in 14 grams per second, and that got the truck running without me having to pedal the gas. But then we just went back in and did some final tweaks to that table, and so that, again, that's the table that the computer looks at and decides basically how far to open the throttle, which in this case is the idle air controller, to keep the idle RPM at its target. And so how you know you've got that number right is when the short-term idle trim and long-term idle trim are making minimal corrections. And so if either one of those are making big corrections, you got to go back and do a bit more fine-tuning of your airflow table there. So okay guys, I hope that shed a little bit of light or gave you a little bit of more information as to why I made the changes I made. Now I'm gonna fire up the laptop again and hop in the truck, and I'm gonna change those base, I can't remember exactly what it's called now without having my computer in front of me, but basically your base idle spark tables, I'm going to change them from 30 to 25. And then I'll show you guys one other issue. I was still having issues with the truck idling in drive, and you could see it at the end of the last video, the timing bouncing all over the place. So I'll show you guys how I diagnosed that and got rid of that. So by the end of the video here, we'll have the truck idling basically perfectly, hopefully. So we'll fire up the computer view now and hop in the truck and do some final tweaks. Okay guys, I got my scanner open here. Truck is running, as you guys can hear. I still haven't figured out how to get good audio when I'm recording and the truck is running, so it sounds kind of crappy, but so I just wanted to show you guys. I went in and changed those base spark advance tables at idle in both park and in gear tables to 25. And you can see it's, other than the occasional little correction, it's at 25. But I just wanted to demonstrate the truck idle's fine. It's in park right now, and you can see it's hanging in there. It's the computer's calling for 800 RPM, and it's pretty much staying within that plus or minus 50 tolerance that I'd like to see. Goes out of it every once in a little while, but I can live with that. But I wanted to show you it idles fine in park like it is right now. You can hear it idles fine in reverse. We'll put it in reverse right now, and you can hear it idling fine. It's still holding 25 degrees. Put it in neutral, it idles fine, still holding around that 25 degrees. But what I want to show you is as soon as I shift into park, the idle goes to crap, and you can see the computer pulling a bunch of timing. So I'll show you that now. I'm just shifting to park, or sorry, to drive, and you can hear it's idling crappy, and you can see that timing bouncing. Like now it's in the negatives and it's bouncing all over the place and sounding like crap. So, and as soon as I switch back to neutral, it takes a little bit for it to catch itself, but now we're back to 25 degrees of timing. So I wanted to figure out what is causing that causing the computer to pull all that timing as soon as I shifted into drive. So I'll just shut off the truck for a sec. So I went in, we'll stop scanning. Come on, stop scanning. I made another channel configuration here, this timing advance. So basically I logged every parameter here that could either add timing or take away timing from the main spark table. So we will, I'll fire up the truck again. We'll start recording here, and then it'll be pretty clear which one of these is pulling all that timing, and then we can go into the editor and fix what's causing that issue. So I'll fire up the truck now and we'll demonstrate that. We'll start scanning again. So again, I'm in park. Everything's, and you can see down here, our short-term idle trims are good, long-term idle trims are good. And the longer it runs, the better these will get, but that's basically perfect. Idle timing is where we want it to be at the table. Short-term and long-term idle trims are telling us our base airflow table is correct. So idle in park is perfect. We'll switch to reverse for a second. And you can see here our airflow table is a little bit out yet because it's having to add about 2 grams per second. So we could go back in and tweak that, but it's calling for it to be at 750 RPM. Like, I can still totally live with that. Switch it to neutral. That's fine. Now we'll switch it to drive. And now all of a sudden you can see our intake air advance is pulling some timing, and our torque management advance is pulling a bunch here. So basically we're going to go in, now I can see the coolant advance, but it's this torque management one that's causing the main issue. Like there you can see it's pulling, now it's not pulling any, but now it's pulling 25 degrees of timing. So I'm going to shift back to park. We'll shut the truck off. And once again, to make things stop dinging, disconnect from here. And so now I'm going to go into the editor and we will disable that torque management. And I think that's mainly what's been causing my issues. There's a little bit of timing being pulled because of that intake air temperature and engine coolant temperature, but I don't want to mess with that because I want it to do that if the truck gets hot or if it's sucking in hot air or whatever. We want it to pull a bit of timing, but it's that torque management that is what's causing my terrible idle in drive. So we're going to go into torque management, this retard versus RPM table. And so this is, no, I don't think that isn't what I want. Where is it? No, it's right here. This spark retard versus torque reduction. Pretty much looks the same, but basically when the computer is wanting to reduce the engine torque by 25%, it pulls like 24 degrees of timing. So I think that's what's happening. So I'm basically going to zero out this whole table. I've selected it all, put a 0 in that box, make it equal 0. And yeah, you'll notice in that last video there's one time where I entered 30 degrees in the box or whatever, but forgot to go over and click that equal sign, so the table didn't actually change. But now this table's actually changed. We'll write it to the truck. And I did notice on initial startup, it takes 5 or 10 seconds for the truck to kind of find its happy spot. So there might be a little more tweaking that can be done there. There's like a throttle cracker and startup airflow and throttle follower and a few other parameters that I haven't messed with yet. But once the truck's been running for 10 or 15 seconds, it goes to normal. So we've wrote that to the truck. Now we'll go back to the scanner. Just got a text there that distracted me for a second, so we'll connect. I'll start the truck again. And yeah, you can hear there, it just kind of stumbles for 10 seconds or so. But now it's pretty well back to normal. So now we'll go in and try put it in drive again. So that's in park, that's in reverse, still does fine. Back to neutral, it's doing fine. Now we'll try it in park or in drive. Keep getting my gears, and it's sounding way better. Like you can, it's right at 25 degrees. Every once in a while it pulls a tiny bit of timing, but it sounds 100% better. We could, it looks like based on these short-term idle trims and our idle desired airflow, we could go back to that base desired airflow table and increase it to about 10. So I'll continue to tweak that, you know, as time goes on. But you know, it's sitting here in drive idling, it's maintaining that plus or minus 50 RPM pretty much, so pretty happy with it. So flip the camera around or go back to the camera mode here and talk to you guys for a second. Alright, so I think that was the last piece of the puzzle. That torque management table was messing up my idle in drive there. So we've got that working the way it should. I may have to make well, I probably don't even have to, but I probably will make a few final tweaks to that base airflow in gear table, because it seemed to be wanting slightly more airflow. But I'm pretty happy with it. It's definitely drivable. I can take it to the track, take it to local cruise nights or whatever, and I know it's not going to stall when I come up to a stop sign or a park light, and it's working pretty well. So we're going to wrap it up for this one. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for liking and subscribing and commenting. Thanks to Philistino for that question. And we'll talk to you on the next one. Bye for now.